So presenting on something I've called the equality illusion. I suppose in each of these things I'm trying to kind of show what I've been doing for the last few years. So I've sort of meshed a few things together. It won't entirely sit that easily together, but I suppose some of the idea I think of these presentations is to sort of explain to colleagues who don't know what you're up to, what you're actually doing, if you're doing anything. So I've called it the equality illusion as some sort of way of holding together these different themes. So just to give you an overview then, I want to argue that equality is an important issue to most of us, but that it has some dilemmas about it, or tensions. I want to look at a book called The Spirit Level, which I suppose implicitly claim to sort these tensions out. Look at some of the problems with the claims in the book that I've made, and also some of the empirical problems that have been identified. So I should say the book made a big splash when it was published, and still, certainly in sociological circles, is seen as a sort of a Bible. I want to slightly switch then and talk about the social psychology of equality. In other words, what do people think about? What are the perceptions that people have about equality in their society? Do people think they live in an egalitarian society? I want to shift then and talk about what we tend to focus on equality of income, obviously, but maybe there's also other things we could think about, like equality of well-being, or even equality of happiness. How well is happiness shared out? And then I want to conclude by, I suppose, as I say, talking about my own research that I've found I've been moving away from materialism and towards what some people call mentalism, which is the stress on the mind, or on mental processes. So it's a fairly long presentation. I'll try to go through it fairly quickly, so we might be able to discuss anything you find of interest. Okay, so equality is obviously a big issue. It's a big issue for most people, I think. It was interesting that in the constitutional change last year, that same-sex marriage was framed as marriage equality. So I think we can see that generally equality is a narrative theme that has appeal and importance to a lot of people at the moment. Obviously, income equality, certainly since the 1960s, in most countries, and probably since the 1970s in Ireland, income equality is a big deal. And there are different perspectives on it. Obviously, there's a traditional left-wing perspective on income equality, whereby big income differences are seen as wrong, and certain policies are proposed, like tax and welfare, so tax the rich and give welfare to the poor. So this is in order to try to ameliorate some of the situation with regard to big income inequalities. And there's also concern that, and empirical evidence that income equality has widened in most of the Western societies since the 1980s, and obviously this is a concern to a lot of people. But it's not a concern to everybody. For some people, equality is one important priority, but there are other priorities. For example, for people on the political right, there's always the danger that when you try to fix inequality with strong redistributive policy, so strong taxation and generous welfare, that there may be unintended consequences which are not particularly helpful. So you might destroy work incentives among the less skilled, it is commonly argued. And also a belief, maybe more positively, that people who work hard and use their talents should be properly rewarded for that, and shouldn't be taxed to the hilt necessarily. So you have this, I think, reasonable and logical disagreement between different people. This creates a political dilemma. On the one hand, most of us think it's wrong that billionaires should have obscene amounts of money while there are several thousand families homeless, for example, in Ireland. At the same time, it also seems wrong to necessarily to take everything from people who've worked hard for it and give it to other people sometimes who show less inclination to do so. So you have a tension between two reasonable beliefs. There's no obviously right answer, or at least not inherently, I think. So who do we turn to? We turn to philosophers if we have a dilemma. And this issue of equality and how far society had an obligation to try to fix big differences in society was a source of a fairly reasonably well-known debate outside philosophy in the 1970s between John Rawls and Robert Nozick. So John Rawls, in a pretty famous book, Theory of Justice, argued that behind what he called a veil of ignorance, we would choose a just distribution. And a veil of ignorance is a thought experiment used by philosophers quite often. And it asks people to imagine that you are about to be born into a society, and you have to decide how fair or unfair or how hierarchical that society would be. But it's behind a veil of ignorance. You don't know where you'll end up being positioned in that society. So you could end up at the top of the heap, or you could end up at the bottom. And Rawls argues that behind the veil of ignorance, people will tend quite reasonably to argue that society should be fairly egalitarian. In other words, there shouldn't be big differences, because if you're being in some way rational about your future self, your concern will be that if you come into this society, you could end up at the bottom of the ladder. So he argues this pushes us towards a reasonable belief in a just distribution in society. Nozick, a conservative, responded a few years later, though, and argued that actually you don't make decisions behind veils of ignorance in reality. And he likens society in some ways to a group of students who are starting out at the beginning of an academic year. And he said they might all believe at the beginning of the academic year that they would like to all end up at the same grade. But once people start studying and reading and so on, they very quickly will move away from this position, and the students who are hardworking will believe that it's legitimate that they should get better grades than the ones who work less. So Nozick argues that the veil of ignorance thought experiment doesn't really work in reality, and that most of us have a belief that if we work hard, we should be rewarded for it. Now, I don't want to necessarily get into it. My point here is that philosophers can clarify these kinds of debates, but they can't really ultimately, I think, resolve them. We're often left with these tensions, and often we're left with these tensions until we use empirical data, and they sometimes can help us. But there was an important book, as I mentioned, The Spirit Level, which appeared in 2009. Two British, not sociologists as sometimes thought, but epidemiologists, so people interested in public health, published a book called The Spirit Level, which made, I suppose, as an academic book, a very big splash, sold well into the hundreds of thousands of copies. And in this, Richard Wilkinson had previously published a book in 1996 called Unequal Societies, where I suppose he made a fairly similar argument, although not as well developed as with his co-author Kate Pickett. And in this book they looked at the data for essentially the richest societies in the world. They went to look at the top 50. We'll see that they looked at 23. I'll explain some of that in a little bit. And also looked at 50 US states. And if you've done any analysis with US data, it's quite handy because of the states' structure. You get these federal reports which breaks down lots of measures and gives you the data for each of the states. So it's quite handy. It goes readily into various Excel files that you can do analysis on it. Anyway, the Spirit Level was interested in, is there a link between general income equality in society and some important social indicators? So, for example, things like health outcomes, infant mortality, educational standards, drug and alcohol abuse, life expectancy, and so on. All of these were looked at in the Spirit Level, and their argument was, and their analysis based on the data, was that more unequal societies, or states, tend to suffer from a huge number of dysfunctions. So things like poorer health outcomes, greater infant mortality, and so on, lower life expectancy. And in a way, if you think about this dilemma between equality and equity, it seems to perhaps provide the answer, because it suggests that really the answer is that equality has to come first, because it suggests that both rich and poor suffer from living in very unequal societies. So both will, in fact, benefit in the long term, even if people who are wealthy don't often see that. The argument is that they will benefit by living in a less dysfunctional, healthier, wiser society with less crime and so on. And it seems to kick the argument away from under the people on the right of the position, political position, Because who could sensibly argue for things like free enterprise and more affluence or low taxes if you can make a good argument that actually a proper redistributive state is the right way forward. And lots of people welcomed it. In fact, although I've become critical of their position, I did publish a paper more than 12 years ago in the Journal of Economic Psychology, actually arguing that Wilkinson's point was correct and trying to show it with some data on life satisfaction. So I suppose I'm somebody who's moved away from, but was initially a fan of the Wilkinson position, but I've become a bit more sceptical. I'm probably just more right-wing as I've got older. So, so do the claims stand up that the spirit level makes, that income growth, as for example is argued, is no longer important, and the focus should turn to income differentials within wealthy societies? I should qualify that they don't argue that growth is irrelevant in poorer societies. They say it's still very important in poorer societies, but once you get to a certain level of wealth, that you should the purpose of policy should be to put affluence behind more important values like parity, solidarity, and so on, in order to create a less dysfunctional society, a less anxious society. So some problems that I've identified here that I want to talk through, that having thought more and more about the arguments in the spirit level, that I came to be dissatisfied with it. And you'll see that it's published as a research working paper. One implicit lesson is if you want to publish work on equality, it's probably easier on income equality to publish work that's in favour of income equality rather than... It's hard to find journals except that are papers that are critical of income equality, or at least I've certainly found that. But anyway, here's some points that are raised in spirit level that I feel are not... or that I've explored, and that I think the spirit level is incorrect. I'll actually move forward because each of these points is dealt with in turn. Okay, so they argue that Wilkinson and Pickett argue in the spirit level that there's that wealth has to take a second place to equality. That if we sacrifice equality for wealth, that we're going to create more dysfunctional societies. So if we promote wealth, we sacrifice equality, and equality is a more important outcome. But I used their own data, which is drawn from the UNHCR reports. So I took the data that was in their own appendices, and I looked at the correlation, which they didn't look at, but between equality and wealth, and actually found a reasonably strong positive correlation. In other words, there is no, as far as I could see, no prima facie evidence that equality and wealthiness necessarily have to be traded off between them. The correlation is 0.53. In other words, societies that tend to be more equal tend to be wealthier. Now, I know we often think about quite a wealthy society like the US, and it's relatively unequal, but if you think about other societies that are the Denmarks, the Norways, the Finlands, and so on, they tend to be quite egalitarian, and they tend to be quite wealthy. So there's actually, by and large, no trade-off that I can see necessarily between wealth and equality, but that is something that is a core principle of the spirit level. They also rely on a pretty basic mistake, I think. Correlational data are used to imply causality, which is obviously something you learn in first-year research methods, that is something you shouldn't do. For example, they talk about Finland's educational successes. This is based on the PISA, the Programme of International Educational Comparisons between countries, looking at how 15-year-olds do on a number of core areas like reading and writing their own language, maths and science. And so they obviously like Finland comes out as quite a nice example, it appears, of highly egalitarian and also very successful. One of the big winners usually in the PISA scores. But British educationalist Alan Smithers points out that Finland heads the published rankings because there's very few new arrivals. In other words, there's low immigration. If only native children, those born in the country of assessment, or have one parent born in that country, are considered, it's actually the Netherlands would be the top scorer in maths. So if you think about it, I mean, I've been an immigrant myself. Often when you're an immigrant, you don't know the rules of society. Parents of immigrants don't necessarily know the shortcuts, for example, when they come to Ireland, of the things to study and so on for the Leaving Cert. Immigrants also tend to be disproportionately poorer than a native population. So a society like the Netherlands that's relatively immigrant friendly therefore becomes more income egalitarian as it brings in immigrants because of the gap between natives and immigrants, whereas Finland in a sense is being implicitly praised for its lack of appeal to immigrants, and the outcome being partly being these educational successes. The Spirit level also tends to focus on income equality or income inequality as the key area. But actually there's a very good OECD book on equality called Growing Unequal, where the OECD researchers evaluate economic inequalities. And they make the point that cash income in itself, which tends to be the focus of the Spirit level, cash income in itself is not actually the be-all and end-all. Often people can have quite reasonably high standards of living, even if their cash incomes are quite low, because they may live in a society where a lot of services are free at the point of demand, so or else heavily subsidised, like education and health. And in fact, the EU recognised this. Eurostat, the EU statistical wing, when it gathers information on income equality, gathers information before what it calls social transfers for government and after social transfers. And social transfers make a big deal. For example, Ireland, you may have heard it, a study from late last year, Ireland, in terms of before transfers, is actually quite an inegalitarian country, but after transfers are made, in other words, state payments and so on, levels of inequality reduce. So to quote the OECD study, the effect of government services in narrowing the Gini coefficient of income inequality is quite large. Measures of inequality based on annual cash incomes overstate the overall inequality of resources available to households. And of course, savings also matter. If you just focus on income, you ignore savings. And one of the most important savings most people make during their lifetime is to buy a house. So when you pay a mortgage every month, you are in one way saving your income. And ironically, one of the ways in which the OECD points out, one of the ways in which inequality grew was that in fact older people tended to do relatively well in the last few decades because often they had fairly generous state pensions but also had purchased their own house. So one of the big things that most people have to grapple with, which is to pay a monthly rent or mortgage, for a lot of older people this isn't something they have to deal with. And so they have these savings in terms of a house, for example, already purchased. So again, to quote the OECD, the older people are, the less likely they are to be deprived materially, and the more likely they are to hold greater assets. So this is another important factor in terms of not focusing entirely on income as a source of inequality. Another claim made in the Spirit level, I'm almost there, don't worry, in terms of these, is that there's an argument that we've become obsessed with consumerism, that in terms of we're obsessed with brands, and this ultimately makes us unhappy. This is an argument that the Spirit level makes, that we're in this treadmill of trying to seek out more and more fancy goods. So our consumerism and our addiction to shopping and spending is part of our unhappiness in modern society. But if you think about it, one of the most regular ways which we spend is our groceries. And if you think about the big success in Ireland in the last 2 decades, it's actually been Lidl and Aldi that have come in and have broken the traditional grocery market. And indeed, they've done it all over Europe. And they're interesting because they're what's called in the business hard discounters. That is, they tend only to offer a single limited product range and usually low-priced generic brands, apart from Coke, crisps, Guinness, the basic facts of life. But on most things, they're offering these low-price generic brands, and these have been taken up very successfully. And they now have over 17% of market share in Ireland from 0% in 1999. So I would argue that we're not necessarily obsessed, at least in a lot of our shopping, with these brand goods, and they don't tend to shape our happiness in any great way. Another of the arguments is that our affluence has really reached the limits of what it can do for us in the very wealthy societies, and that in fact we've ended up now in a spiral of spending, chasing these what they call affluent yuppie toys. In particular, the mobile phone seems to really get to them as a kind of waste of money in terms of chasing luxuries in wealthy societies. But in fact, most of the analysis, people who've thought about, say, things like mobile phones, have suggested that they tend to be quite revolutionary in terms of the developing world. So although you could argue, although I would argue against it, you could argue that the mobile phone is a wasteful toy in the Western world. Most people have considered it in terms of developing countries, have suggested that it's been revolutionary. So places like, for example, Kenya, bad roads and unreliable postal services, few trains, parlous landlines. These mobile phones allow quicker and easier access to information on prices, enable traders to reach wider markets, boost entrepreneurship, and generally make it easier to do business. That's from The Economist. Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University's Earth Institute argues that the mobile phone, in fact, is the single most transformative tool for development. So if you want to know, if you live in Kenya and you want to know how much your particular fruit's selling for a particular day in terms of being a trader yourself, the mobile phone is very important where landlines may not be in existence and you may not be able to easily travel around. So affluence and its byproducts, I would argue, can benefit not just the wealthy but also benefit the bottom billion of the world's population as well. And the final claim made by the Spirit level is that gender equality or gender inequality is made worse in societies that have great income inequality. And again, I took the countries that they took themselves, the 23 countries, took the same data they did, but then also looked at the information on the Gender Development Index, which is a score in terms of equality of men and women in different societies. It's calculated by the United Nations in their Human Development Report. So each country is given a score, a value for the gap between men and women, if you like, and the higher the score, the less gender disparity there is. So women are closer to men where you have high GDI scores. And so when I looked at this in terms of their claim that women do better in more equal societies, and found, yes, that's true, women do better in more equal societies, but women also do better in wealthier societies. And if you use multiple regression to try to tease out the effect, actually affluence is the factor that's doing most of the heavy pulling. The income equality is modestly associated, but affluence in fact had a much higher statistical score, suggesting that what's important actually is that for narrowing the gap between men and women, what's important is a society that's wealthy rather than a society necessarily that is focused on income equality. So gender equality is favoured by economic growth, not hindered. Income equality is positive also, but only has a minor effect. So that's, I think, some logical problems that occurred to me in terms of the Spirit level. The sociologist Peter Saunders also. There have been a number of critics. I think Saunders produced quite a good criticism, and he took the same countries and gathered the same data more or less, and yet managed to come up with a completely different point of view. So he looked at the 20 claims made in the Spirit level about the benefits of income equality, and he argued that only one of these, which was the link between infant mortality and inequality, was unambiguously supported in the data that he found, and at least 14 were either spurious or invalid. Why did they reach? How can people with looking at the same data sets reach very different conclusions? Probably their political ideology, I would suggest, is even when people are trying not to be biased. I think obviously our personal biases do tend to creep through. But both actually set out with the same intention. Look at the top wealthiest 50 countries in the world, plus the 50 US states. So the Spirit level ended up picking out 23 countries, and the reason they didn't pick out the top 50 is they argued there are places like Monaco or Macau which are essentially what they would argue tax havens. So they set the cutoff point at 3 million. So a country had to have a population of 3 million or more, supposed to be considered a country. But that seems, if you think about it, a lot of countries, for example, does anyone seriously think Slovenia is not a serious country, or Estonia, Trinidad and Tobago, Latvia, the Gabon, Botswana? All of these, Saunders argued, are legitimate. They have a population between 1 and 3 million that they're legitimate to include for analysis. He also included Hungary, Slovakia, Lithuania, Croatia, Russia, Libya, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, got Libya down twice, South Korea, and the Czech Republic. These had all been excluded by the spirit level. The argument being that the data, there weren't essentially good or reliable data available on the income equality in these countries. Saunders argues that the data are there and they're reliable, so he includes these. So it's clear that he's looking at a bigger set, a more culturally broad set, I suppose, than the spirit level. So he ends up at 44 countries, and they ended up at 23. So that's, I suppose, the main reason why they're reaching different conclusions is which countries do you include and which data sets. He also used one measure for income equality through all his analysis, that is with the US and with the wealthier societies. And Wilkinson and Pickett argue, which is true, that measures of income inequality tend to correlate fairly well. They do, but they don't correlate perfectly. So you get maybe 0.7 or 0.8 type correlations, depending if you use things like the Gini coefficient. So this is an economic measure looking at the proportion of wealth or income earned by the bottom 50% of the population. But sometimes, without explaining, they switch to a different ratio, which is a different measure, which is the 80-20 ratio, which is how much does the top 20% earn compared to top 80%. And that's unusual because if you're using ratios, the more normal one is the 90-10 ratio, which is you compare the top 10% to 90%. Anyway, they don't explain why. I suppose the suspicion might be that it helps their case to switch around. I have no basis for saying that. I'm just saying that that's one suspicion for why you wouldn't use the same measure. But I don't have any basis for saying that. Saunders, to his credit, I think uses the Gini coefficient all the way through in analysing both the US data and also the richest country data. So this is, I suppose, why he finds different things. But he looks at the same sort of phenomena and argues that he only found it strongly replicated the spirit level claim for infant mortality. That is, more egalitarian societies tend to have higher levels of infant mortality. Moderately, he found for trust levels in society. In other words, more inegalitarian societies have somewhat lower levels of trust. Imprisonment rates moderately higher. Teenage births moderately higher, and life expectancy in the US states moderately higher in more equal states. But he didn't find any significant replication, as was found in the spirit level, for homicide rates, childhood conflict, women's status, foreign aid, that's foreign aid paid by the state, international life expectancy, adult or childhood obesity, literacy, numeracy, social mobility. So these are all variables or outcomes that the spirit level says are equal societies do better on. He finds no evidence for that. And he finds high levels of income inequality were linked, in fact, to lower suicide rates, lower divorce rates, higher fertility rates, and less alcohol consumption. And somewhere like Finland, very egalitarian, but a fairly notorious problem with binge drinking among pretty much all sections of its population. So that would be an example of that. So Saunders argues that like several generations of left-wing utopians before them, Wilkinson and Pickett think that America and Britain could be made to look just like Sweden if only the income distribution were changed. But Sweden and for example, Japan are not cohesive societies because their incomes are equally distributed. Their incomes are equally distributed because they are cohesive societies. So he's offering a different causal model, I suppose. So I looked myself at some equality data, trying to replicate the spirit level data, mainly drawn from around 2000, 2001, Saunders around 2007. So I looked at data available 2001, 2011, 2012, or as close as possible to that date. I found consistent data available for 28 of the wealthiest 50 countries. I used the 90-10 ratio because the Gini coefficient wasn't available for all of them. but the 90 to 10 ratio of measure of inequality was. And so I suppose Slovenia might be slightly surprising, but Slovenia and Norway were the most egalitarian, and US and Israel were the least egalitarian on terms of income share. And just to cut to the chase, what did I find in terms of the outcomes? I used the Cohen's rule of thumb in terms of effect size. I mean, you can use significance, statistical significance, but I mean, if you do, the model collapses. Really, the spirit level model collapses because you tend to have fairly small numbers of states. So you're talking about 28. So you're probably better off looking at effect size. But for those of you who like statistical significance, you're really just talking about a very small number that actually achieve a statistically significant result. And of course, if you're looking at an awful lot of factors, you could argue you should push to a more conservative P score. So basically, I don't think it's reasonable to expect these kind of data with so much noise in them necessarily to reach statistical significance. But at least we want them to have the effect size to be in the right direction and to be somewhat strong. I would argue. But I found that the only very strong result was prisoners, this is number of people in prison, number of adults in prison was highly correlated with income inequality. So more unequal societies tend to have more people in prison. A modest correlation in terms of spending on aid, infant mortality and homicide. A small, so when I'm talking small, I'm talking about an R of 0.265, 0.220, or even 0.112 for trust, obesity, or drug deaths. Negligible or no effect for gender equality in these days, life expectancy, PISA scores, or alcohol deaths per society. And more unequal societies had less male and female suicide, had more women in positions of power. So again, it doesn't, to me, the spirit level, if you try to replicate it and you try to be consistent with the measures, it doesn't seem to hold up. Even if it did hold up, if you think about it, even if you did get a very strong correlation in relationships and you went, wow, that's very strong, that's really only the entry ticket into a policy debate, because, to reiterate, correlation is not cause. Just to show that more equal societies almost always do better doesn't establish that equal societies do better because they're equal. And really if you think about it, that's the core of their argument, is that we should be trying to push towards more equality because equality will make things happen. But even to show correlations, of course, wouldn't achieve that. They argue it's self-evident. What else could be doing it? What else could explain these modest correlations? I would argue that, and there's a very good paper by Engelhardt, argue that in fact good governance could be responsible for quite a lot of outcomes, like outcomes in health, education and social equality. So if you had a series of wise, well-informed governments, they might be able to work on a few different fronts, like improving people's health, improving people's education and increasing social equality, but they don't consider this as a possibility. Even if you did establish a plausible causal model, which stood up to pretty robust statistical tests, it doesn't necessarily make the argument that more equality will necessarily produce more of these outcomes. If you think about an analogy to fertilizer, some fertilizer, obviously, if you throw it on crops, will increase the amount of crops, but there has to be some level at which you can keep adding more fertilizer. At some level, it will probably start poisoning the crops, you could argue. So just to show that even if you could argue plausibly that some of the good outcomes in society tend to be linked to equality, doesn't necessarily establish that pushing for ever more progressive taxation, for example, is going to achieve what you want. There's the fairly well-known story of the Swedish author of Pippi Longstocking, Astrid Lundgren, I think, who was apparently sent in the 1970s, the height of the Swedish social democratic attempt to redistribute wealth, was sent a letter looking for 105% of her annual income in terms of taxation. So at a certain point, obviously, there are limits to taxation. Or to put it more formally, higher taxes may impact negatively on a number of important decisions workers make about their lives. So So tax on income is expected to affect hours worked, but may also affect accumulation of human capital, the intensity with which people work, and the timing of their retirement. So living standards might decline if you attempt to use taxation as a lever. So you're faced with trying to decide how important the spirit level is. So Wilkinson and Pickett argue, obviously the authors, the remarkable data the book lays out, the measures it uses are like a spirit level which we can hold up to compare the conditions of different societies. Whereas you get someone like Saunders who says the evidence is weak, the analysis is superficial, the theory is unsupported. I think it's an interesting claim in spirit level. It has certainly made people think about equality, but I don't feel that it has done much more than set the opening grounds for exploring this question. Some people feel that it's closed the question and that it's established its case. I don't think so. So just to move on to a slightly different topic, but this is, I suppose, related in the sense that quite a lot of what we think about equality may be related not to actual equality, but maybe our own biases and our own perceptions. I like this quote from the historian A.J.P. Taylor, what men think, men being what she wrote in 1954 obviously, what men think is more important in history than the objective facts. And this, I suppose, is a nice entry into the social psychology of equality. Not so much objective equality in and of itself, but what do people think about it? What are people's perceptions about equality, including social scientists? What are the representations held by the public about inequality and equality? Are people accurate? Are publics accurate about equality? Are there cleavages in the views of people? Do different groups tend to think different things? And across different societies, you have different histories. You have societies that were, for example, dominated by Marxism, so you have communist-dominated populations, and also then you have the Anglo-Saxon, the English-speaking laissez-faire societies, like the US, the UK, and New Zealand. So I have a paper under review, the European Journal of Social Psychology, looking at this, and the data set I'm analysing this was from the ISSP in 2009, which included a very large module on social inequality. So what did people think about social inequality? For those of you who don't know, the ISSP tend to produce quite nice data sets. They do surveys every, it's either twice every 1 year or once every 2 years. I can't remember, but it's once every 2 years, sorry, yes. And so they pick a topic and then they go into it in a nice amount of detail. So I looked at their data from 2009. They did look at 39 countries, surveyed 39 countries, but I wanted to link it up with data on actual income equality in those societies. So that reduced the analysis to 28 countries. So roughly about 1,300 adults in 28 countries. The analysis is only at one level, country level. So the type of items of interest in the survey, so one question was, how much money do you think a chairman of a large corporation and an unskilled factory worker typically earn in your country? So that's meant to, I suppose, capture the gap between the very rich and the and fairly poor. And then items of agreement or disagreement on differences of income in this country are too large. So this is how acceptable do you find the level of equality in your society. People are also asked to position themselves on a 10-rung, imagine society as a 10-rung ladder. Where are you on that ladder? Respondents were also asked to pick, they were offered a series of diagrams of societies of which outline a profile of the rich and the poor. How many people are rich, how many people are poor. So two distributions were highly elitist, so a small number of people at the very top with most of the wealth, and the rest below. Three others are more balanced. So people are asked to say, well, what does your society look like? People are asked to also estimate their own earnings and their own earnings relative to others. And then obviously income equality was provided by official data, OECD data. And again, you get the Nordics, like Denmark and Norway, tend to be quite equal. Chile was very unequal. So you get some elements of objectivity. People who lived in more unequal societies quite correctly gauged or guessed that there would be a wider gap in the earnings of an unskilled factory worker and the chairman of a large company. So the correlation was medium but strong enough. So in other words, the more you live in an unequal society, the more you think there's going to be a big gap between the rich and poor, which makes sense. But some elements of it were less objective. This is not a great chart, I have to admit, but I was trying to indicate that there's two things going on here. On the x-axis, this is actual income equality as measured by official data. So as you go from left to right, societies are becoming more unequal. So Chile is out there at the very end, and that's the most unequal society. Denmark is the most equal, so it's on the most leftward. And then what you have here is on the y-axis is concern about equality, and my mistake I think is that as societies become more concerned, I mapped it downwards, I should have done it upwards, but so Hungary, for example, is most upset about inequality. Norway is the least concerned about inequality. And then, but you can also see that they're quite wide off it actually doesn't do much of the explaining the actual equality level. But there are other curious things. You can look at societies that are actually quite egalitarian, like Slovakia, Slovenia, Hungary, Czech Republic, France. Fairly egalitarian, but actually they're among the most concerned societies. So even though their societies have the least gaps between rich and poor, if you want to think of it that way, their populations are among the most concerned. Not surprisingly, I think Norway and Denmark and Finland don't tend to be that concerned, because I think most of their citizens are aware that it's a big deal equality is a big deal in terms of policy for their country, so they probably feel that all that can be done is being done. Just to put it a different way, these are the societies that are most concerned about inequality. These are the societies that are least concerned, if you like, about inequality. And I think some interesting patterns here. If you look at the ones that are most concerned about inequality, a lot of them are among the most equal, but also you tend to get societies that either used to be dominated by the Soviet Union and had communist parties in control. So you have Hungary, Estonia, Slovenia, Slovakia, Russia, some of Germany, and Poland. So those are countries that certainly would have had a lot of the older generation would have grown up in terms of, say, I suppose a pro-Marxist education. And then you also have Italy, France, and Portugal, which had the largest communist parties in Western Europe. And it's interesting to me that these have ended up being the ones that are most concerned about inequality, even though inequality is not necessarily the highest there. Whereas the ones that actually are least concerned, well, they're the Nordics, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, but I think they're least concerned because they feel that most has been done about it. Then you have countries that are quite inegalitarian: the US, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, these Anglo-Saxons, the ones where people are fairly, relatively, not too worried about inequality, even though they're among the most unequal. I suppose the argument I've made in the paper is, alongside the effects of actual levels of income inequality, there's an amplification in different directions, probably depending on a series of representations the publics hold about society and social difference. In jurisdictions where Marxist regimes existed or Marxist political influence was large in the post-World War II era, the stories people tell themselves about their society stress elitism, corruption and deprivation. In English-speaking societies, despite often higher levels of inequality, people have more benign myths about the modern economy, linked to beliefs that social mobility will clean the slate. In other words, as long as there's very high beliefs in these societies that although we're unequal, social mobility is high. In other words, the children of I may suffer inequality, but the slate will be cleaned, and my children will have a good chance. Actually, those tend to be untrue. Most people overestimate social mobility in the English-speaking countries, but the myth is there. People believe it, and so they're less concerned about inequality. So the kinds of things that predicted more concern about that inequality is a big problem. So countries with a high level of concern about inequality, even controlling for actual inequality, have great proportions of people believing that they live in an elitist society. Strongly associated with the belief that corruption is useful in personal success in life, that you need to be corrupt to get on. And also, people are more pessimistic about their own relative economic position. I'll just move briefly on. That's just some statistics, regression, trying to make that case. And that's the last part of the talk I want to just mention is we tend to focus on income as a big deal, and of course it is in some ways, but there are other things you could think about in terms of sharing, in terms of equality. For example, one thing is equality of happiness. How much is happiness shared out in the world, which may seem a strange concept, but there is an assumption that we should focus on income and money, and I suppose a lot of this is influenced by the media and economics, that if you have more money you can buy more dishwashers, and if you have more dishwashers you're happier. But it's not necessarily true. Initially the economist Richard Easterlin proposed that, or found that against most economic assumptions, actually higher levels of economic growth don't necessarily translate into happiness. So he found that looking at data of happiness, surveys asking people about their happiness in the US in the 1940s, 1960s, the proportion saying they were very happy remained almost constant at around 30%, despite very big real incomes in economic growth. And so this produced the Easterlin paradox. We tend to crave more income and feel that it would make us happier, but it doesn't seem to make us or change happiness levels. Some studies, a number of different angles, also making the case that disputing the link that happiness and income are necessarily linked. Ed Diener is one of the big social psychology people involved in this. So he interviewed, for example, people in the top wealthiest in the US. From listening from Forbes, found they were only slightly happier than the average population. Michael Argyle interviewed lottery winners and found that after a short-term euphoria they go back to their old level of happiness. People who had substantial pay rises compared to people with no pay rises, no difference in happiness. Castor found that people who strove for not for money but for things like personal growth and intimacy, contribution to the community, tended to report higher happiness and quality of life. Nice study here. Sheldon asked students most satisfying event in the previous month. So people were asked to do a diary and identify what was the thing that made them happiest in the previous month or contributed to their self-esteem. Luxury and money related items listed 10th as in last out of 10, and other factors were much more important. So maybe instead of focusing on income as our core issue, we should be thinking of how is happiness shared out. Does everyone get a turn at being happy? No. Here's some data looking across the world. So it didn't come out very well, but this is wealth on the x-axis, and this is mean social satisfaction on the y-axis. The bigger countries, not unreasonably, have bigger circles because they have more population, and you find that there is some link between wealth and happiness. So, for example, Denmark and Finland are wealthier than Argentina and tend to be happier. But if you put a line of least squares through it, you can see there's a huge amount of unexplained happiness. In other words, it's not linked to wealth. For example, India is poorer than China, but its population are happier. Venezuela, Costa Rica, very poor societies, but in fact they're happier than quite wealthy, very wealthy societies like Japan and Singapore. Norway is wealthier than Denmark, but Denmark is happier than Norway. So you can see that there's not certainly by no means a perfect relationship with wealth, although it doesn't seem to do any harm in terms of happiness, but it's clearly not the whole deal. What about looking across someone's lifespan? So I have a paper under review in the Journal of Happiness looking at 4 sweeps of a survey, the NCDS. So this is focused on everybody who was born in a certain week in 1958 in the UK, in Great Britain. And I just was interested in one measure in this, a single item self-reported happiness measure between the ages of 33 and 50, so almost 2 decades. And we found moderate to strong correlations across the 4 measures. In other words, people who are happy at 33 tend to be happy at 42, tend to be happier at 46, and so on. So people contented in one sweep typically are contented in another. People unhappy in one sweep typically unhappy in another. So if you think about the 4 sweeps, the maximum you could get is 40 in terms of your happiness over nearly 2 decades. So this group here are interested because these have somehow managed to score 9 or 10 on each happiness rating across the survey. This group fairly unhappy across the 4 measures. They're under 5 on average across 4 measures of happiness, and then this average around 7. But so this group in some ways have mastered the art of being happy. So some people have mastered it. So most people are fairly happy without being euphoric, and then some people are unhappy. What are the predictors? Actually, I say predictors. Anyway, I won't go into it. But the correlates, shall we say, of happiness score. So personality measure is quite important. High emotional stability is linked with higher happiness. Being conscientious is linked with happiness. Not smoking, being extroverted linked with happiness. Higher social class linked with happiness. Religious attendance linked with happiness. So those are so what do we learn? Stability is really often the key message, that there's high levels of stability across 2 decades. Big events don't seem to make, we looked at some different events across in the survey as well, didn't make a huge difference. Predictors of happiness are fairly stable ones themselves, things like personality, gender, religious attachment, social class. Consistent with, in fact, Seligman's view of, Seligman has been interested in positive psychology, and he's argued that happiness, if you think of happiness as 100%, it's divided up into some sort of set range of happiness. Circumstance, which is the C, 10% he thinks quite small. But then the bit that he's hopeful for is this voluntarism, or this mindfulness, that you can try to do things to increase your happiness, be grateful, stop to count your blessings, and so on. My gripe is, I think these are things that happy people do. I don't know, is it these are the things that make you happy? I think it might be the other way around, but I don't have any evidence for that, it's just a hunch. So why do we focus on circumstance when it seems to make a fairly small impact? We tend to go back to our baseline. And this idea was coined, the hedonic treadmill, classic paper by Brickman and Campbell. And they published an empirical examination of this: lottery winners and accident victims, is happiness relative? So in this paper, as I say, quite a classic paper, they interviewed 22 lottery winners, 29 paraplegics who had accidents a few years earlier, and a control group who were of neither group, obviously. No significant or large difference in subjective well-being between lottery winners, paraplegics, and the control group. Both lottery winners and paraplegics reported the same levels of happiness as before either their win or accident. So the hedonic treadmill suggests that as people rise or fall in their accomplishments and possessions, their expectations rise or fall, and they habituate and adapt. Essentially, the story is one of adaptation. An event makes a big splash, but then you go back to your old level. And this pushes towards perhaps a more mentalist approach to happiness rather than a materialist one. So even though there is this pervasive belief that most of us kind of have, that if we just had a bit more money, we'd be a bit happier, there tends to be a lack of evidence for this, a weak correlation between wealth and happiness, high levels of depression in wealthy countries, and as we see, the adaptation phenomenon. And people think if only their wage was doubled, they'd be phenomenally happy. But even people whose wages have been doubled don't tend to be happy for too long. So Mike Csikszentmihalyi, who's associated with the concept of flow, has argued that we should look towards what he calls mentalism, a tradition associated with Epicurus. A happy life is based on developing mental and physical self-discipline, which means that we may be looking in the wrong place when we look to material wealth, but we should look instead to a mental outlook. The most important things in life are not things, which I saw on a coffee coaster in the Burn a few days ago, but I thought was quite good. And this links us to things like mindfulness, learned optimism, and also the concept of flow or autotelic experience. So this is that we should try and engage in activities that are so engrossing or enjoyable they become autotelic, which means worth doing for their own sake, even if there are no tangible rewards associated. So the kinds of things that give us this sense of flow or absorption tend to be music, sport, games, art, religious rituals. People who are autotelic, people who engage in, I suppose, highly skilled, absorbed activity, talk about experiencing this sense of flow, this loss of a sense of time. So Csikszentmihalyi has argued that much of people's happiness means trying to live your life to enable more flow, this complete absorption in a task. And along with Aidan and a PhD student a number of years ago, we looked at and analysed some of the data on musicians and found that elite musicians tend to get this sense of flow. So flow tends to occur when people make themselves fully involved in life, physical, mental or emotional involvement, friendships, intimacy, meditation, so on. Tangible rewards are nice, of course, but the argument is that after a certain threshold they become irrelevant and our mental strengths take over. So I suppose I've tried to show in the research that maybe these things often you don't realise yourself, but it seems to me, at least my research has become more interested in moving away from materialism as the way in which big outcomes occur. I suppose that's why I've got more critical at the spirit level, and more towards things like mental activity and mental engagement. So that's it. Thanks. A lot of slides, so we don't have much time, I'm afraid, but I'd be very interested in any questions or points. Yeah.
I don't know if I missed it, but did you give a correlation between levels of inequality and SWB?
Yes, predictive well-being. I did. Actually, the earlier paper I did that was published, which was pro. It did find a correlation between more equality and happiness, controlling for GDP. Yeah. So so it's certainly helpful. It seems.
I suppose I read I think Wilson and Pickett completely simplified the whole wealth argument and basically said more wealth isn't any better. And I think you've demolished that, and other people have. But I think the inequality one still is there and needs more work, because they actually brought out a lot of the sort of social dynamics and psychological dynamics that go with inequality, like social comparison processes and alienation from the state and all those kind of things. So I still don't know if you can go to completely to the mentalist perspective. And maybe a compromise is that mentalist kind of strategies are going to be more effective given certain social conditions. You'd have to say minimum. Would you agree with the idea that there's some minimal level of inequality?
I think it's hard to do things like flow and learned optimism if your life is awful, and in terms of if your life is economically awful,
absolutely. But even say in terms of I think the great contribution they made is to make it a huge collective issue. It's not just about whether I have money; it's about everybody. So are you saying that doesn't work? That doesn't
I'm just saying my views are sort of changing, and where once I was certain about things, now I'm unsure, and I'm trying to tease it out. But it seems to me that where I once was convinced that economic equality was the key thing you needed, maybe even the very focus on that tends to push us away from the goals we might need to have. I don't know. It sounds very coffee coaster type analysis, but
it's just coming out from a very interesting angle. I think that's.
Thank you. Yeah.
Kind of related to that, when you were talking earlier about the inequality, I was interested, just wondering if people who've experienced different types of social mobility would have different perspectives on inequality. And then when you were talking about all the happiness research, that tends to be kind of a typical way that people look at subjective well-being, is if you've won the lottery or if you've experienced this. I was just wondering if there was similar research around experiences or perceptions of inequality.
Just so the first terms of the first.
So I guess if you found your circumstances as an individual have changed.
Yeah.
Would that shift your perceptions of inequality in society that you're in? I
suppose the hedonic treadmill argument is that eating bread is quickly forgotten, and that even as you move up a social ladder, you start to take it for granted. Now, there are a number of reasons for that, and Ger was alluding to social comparison, that we tend not to compare ourselves collectively. We often tend to compare ourselves to people who are just slightly ahead of us, which ensures a life of constant misery, because we're always looking just a little bit to catch up on the next group. So social mobility, it looks nice in a society, but from the point of view of an individual, it may have limited implications in terms of well-being.
That just sounds a little bit like the research on subjective well-being as well.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
Well, I think there's really two. It seems to me there's two messages. One is that it's not worth doing anything, and the second is that it's worth doing a lot of things. Because the whole hedonic treadmill is quite fatalistic. It just suggests that why bother? Because you're just going to go back to your old level of, whatever your baseline was. After a few weeks, you go back to your old baseline. Whereas then some of the suggestions of positive psychology would be things like learned optimism, flow, and mindfulness as ways of trying to enhance, and I think it's that 40% that Seligman is talking about, trying to, there are a lot of things you can't do much about, and you have your personality and you can't do much about that, but there maybe are some ways of trying to overcome some of the ways in which we become resigned to or overlook some of maybe the positives in our life.
Very quickly, has anybody looked at the issue of something like time? I mean, looking at income inequalities, but there's also time poverty.
Yeah, because time is the ultimate resource, and the ultimate limited resource.
So have you ever factored factor this into the happiness assessments? You know, whether people feel very poor in time or rich in time.
Just so there's no very strong age factor, which if time was but health comes into it as well, because as people get older, their health tends not to be as strong as it was. So it's confounded by poor health. It does seem to be one of these factors that actually can drag people's subjective well-being down, particularly subjective health, what you think your health is, rather than objective health, which is what your doctor thinks your health is. This personal perception of how good or bad your health is seems to have a big impact on subjective well-being. And obviously, you know, as time runs out, your health is running down. So I don't think it's been widely looked at. I think it's interesting, and because I think that there's that William James quote that time is the worm in the apple, the ultimate melancholy. You know, because it's always there in the background that you know it's limited. So. Orange?
I was going to ask you, do you think there are differences between the relationship between income and, you know, subjective well-being versus life satisfaction? So I know there was a paper in PNAS before where it showed that more and more income did matter for your life satisfaction, but at a certain point, I think it was an income of $75,000, that there was a plateau, and then emotional well-being at that point onwards didn't have an effect, and that's where other kind of personal factors came into play. Yeah.
It's bizarre the way it comes up again and again. Either when you look at society, there's this transition point, or you look at individual wealth, there's this transition point. It's when you get over worrying about. I mean, it kind of goes back to the hierarchy of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, once you get beyond worrying about where you're going to sleep and your meals, it's not that you stop worrying. It's just now you're faced with this new set of worries about meaning in your life and esteem and love and all these factors. So, but there's definitely a transition point for individuals and societies, and yeah, it's probably set at something like 75,000. Sounds like a pretty good guess. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming on.